Well, thank you very much. What a wonderful evening. 25 years is a long time, even if you've lived more than twice that amount yourself. Sometimes I feel it in my back. To better appreciate what a quarter of a century can really mean, please consider the following samples of events that took place roughly over the period of time that the Acton Institute has been in existence. We celebrate our silver anniversary tonight, but think about this. In the fall of 1989, informal conversations were underway about the founding of a new institution, a unique effort that would help religious and business leaders think more deeply, more profoundly about the potential for human liberty and virtue, particularly as expressed in a free economy. The working title for this nascent effort was called the Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. The name of Lord Acton would only be applied after many more conversations and as a clearer mission would evolve. You see, we never have seen the body of Lord Acton's work as any kind of a magisterium for our efforts. To be sure, we honor the great synthesis of religion and liberty that's found. And we think that attaching his name to our effort makes our institute a far more personal endeavor. Now, by the Christmas of 1989, as these conversations were underway, Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena were executed in Romania, and Václav Havel would become president of Czechoslovakia, as it was known at the time. And of course, most all of us here tonight know that the Berlin Wall fell. Now, concomitant with that first decade of Acton's founding, the Soviet Union would disintegrate, and their satellites would all become independent. Apartheid in South Africa was dismantled. The Sandinistas would lose the Nicaraguan election, and the Rwandan genocide was triggered, with almost 1 million people literally hacked to death in a 3-month period of time. It was also within this decade that the Taliban captured Kabul and would set up a government in Afghanistan. Hong Kong reverted to China. Chromosome 22 became the first human gene to be fully sequenced. Between the years 1990 and 2000, Steven Spielberg directed Schindler's List. The movie Titanic was released. The novel Harry Potter was published. And the drug Viagra would receive government approval. Now, there is no necessary connection between those events. However, I do find it interesting that the approval for Viagra was in need of government approval, which, to my mind, gives a whole new meaning to impotence. Christianity's second millennium would begin with a worldwide celebration, but without the much prophesied secular Armageddon of Y2K ever taking place. And then, of course, the September 11th attacks occurred in 2001, the same year that Wikipedia was founded. This would also be the decade of the Iraq War. Both Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul the Great died in this decade. The latter's funeral in Rome was not only the largest funeral in all of history, but it possibly was the largest single gathering of Christians ever. And of course, Barack Obama was elected the first African-American president of the United States. Within the last 5 years, we have seen a 7 .0 magnitude earthquake killing 230,000 people in Haiti. Pope Benedict resigned. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of the 2001 attacks, was executed in his hideout in Pakistan. Nelson Mandela and Margaret Thatcher died as well in this decade. King Juan Carlos abdicated the Spanish throne, and ISIS began its bloody offensive in northern Iraq. And then, of course, who could forget the ever-entertaining Occupy Wall Street movement, which inspired anti-free market protests worldwide. The first licenses for cars without drivers was granted in the state of Nevada. The Internal Revenue Service targeted conservative groups for additional scrutiny in tax matters. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, began registering people for expanded federal government health care. King Solomon wisely noted that to everything there is a season. Life and death, love and hate, gathering and dispersing, progress and decline. My friends, the struggle for human freedom is similarly so marked with its ebbs and its flows, yet at its heart is a moral dimension that has bearing on the human journey, which finds specific meaning at very concrete points along the way. One could say that the stuff of human history is either the struggle for human freedom and its meaning, or its consequence. To say that it is at heart a moral undertaking is not to deny the institutional dimensions necessary to ensure and pass along the benefits of freedom. Both must be undertaken. This particularly has relevance in recent days, especially given the emerging bifurcation between religious liberty and economic liberty, and the utter ignorance that many people share as to the connection between the two. Morality and the building of institutions have unique elements, but the more we understand them in their distinctions, the more we will understand them in their overlap. And thus, we will be able to secure human freedom for subsequent generations. My friends, we must own the moral language of liberty once again. We must make its quest a noble mission once again. We must take back the moral presumption in favor of human freedom and the free society. We must so closely associate the struggle for human liberty with its moral foundation that when one hears the call for freedom, they once again think not primarily of profits alone, but of the rightness of the cause in the souls of men. Tonight, I want to announce to you that the mission of the Acton Institute will broaden in the next quarter century in order to take account of the threat to religious liberty and the attack upon the freedom which the right to private property ensures. The right to the fruit of one's labor is not first and foremost the claim to possess material things in themselves, but the claim to own one's own life and the living of it. The first time in the history of political arrangements that a delineation was made between the power of the state and divine authority was when Jesus Christ himself said that we should render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. The importance of this distinction began to emerge over the next 2 millennia, eventually being realized and implemented preeminently in the American founding. In the parlance of most people today, this is spoken of as the separation between church and state. But we all know that those words never appear in the legal documents of the founding. Nonetheless,
they do speak to us of a common sensibility present at the outset that there should be no official American church, or in the words of the First Amendment, and I quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Now, I know that some of you have suggested that the Republic would be much safer today if the First Amendment had stopped after the first 5 words. Took you a little bit to go back, didn't it? Congress shall make no law. I'm beginning to sound like Father Landry. The law of the Lord. Isn't that a good idea? Now, some have suggested that this would be the case, but we are witnesses to the general and increasing confusion in many contemporary minds that sees something more than an institutional separation being called for in this amendment. Some want there also to be a cultural separation as well. The inability to see that there can be an institutional separation between church and state without such a separation between religion and society exists mostly among those who cannot conceive the difference between a society and a state in the first place. These are the same people who think that every social expression has to be a political one. Given the historical influence that America has demonstrated from the abolitionist movement on up through the civil rights movement to today's pro-life movement, this confusion is simply untenable. While even popes have called for a legitimate secular autonomy in society, religion cannot be separated from society because people in society are themselves very often religious if they are free. And if they are free and they are religious, it's simply going to show. Now, it's not my desire tonight to overly dwell on the American founding because the Acton Institute is an international body, as you can see tonight. But the struggle for the American founding tells us something about the struggle for universal freedom. The root of this civic order was to be founded on something broadly spiritual, as they said, upon nature and nature's God. Likewise, the founders speak of humans as endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thus aligning themselves with an even more ancient tradition derived not from creeds or religion, but from the natural law itself as articulated in such seminal thinkers as Aristotle and Plato, as well as classic theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, the American founders were shaped by a Christian culture rooted in the natural law. The latter part of the 18th century was when they sought independence from a reign of a Caesar who had stretched his long arm into their lives, into their businesses, into their homes, attempting to expropriate their property through unjust taxation. To be clear once again, none of this is to say that the original inspiration for independence of the first colonies was to establish a state religion on our shores. But neither was it to establish state atheism or state agnosticism. No, they sought to establish freedom, a freedom compatible with the faith that offered believers of that and subsequent generations the opportunity to build a free, faithful, prosperous, and religious community in the United States. And such an example that would inspire the entire world. When we turn now to the contemporary reality, deep, deep concerns arise. recent juridical, executive, and legislative actions, along with certain cultural trends affecting religious freedom and the right to private property, combine to yield an ominous challenge. And this gives rise to the concern that there could easily be set up the potential to centralize power and impede authentic human freedom and progress and diversity. It is this reality that would turn us back to history's darkest moments, to a reign of control, of dominance, to an era of stagnation. In order to offer an informed speculation on the potential for what the unfolding of these trends might mean, we don't have to look to the far distant past. We can just look back a few years. The Bob Jones University was the very definition of a fundamentalist university in South Carolina for all of its history. As a part of its religious creed, it held that interracial dating at the university was to be prohibited. This was an odious stance, and one undoubtedly that was in need of correction. But as in many things, the real question was not if the stance should be corrected, but how to go about correcting it. Well, in 1976, the Internal Revenue Service had its own idea on how this should be done. And it reached the conclusion that the university did not satisfy the requirements for tax exemption, that it was not, quote, in harmony with the public interest, close quote, and that the university's purpose was, quote, so at odds with the common community conscience as to undermine any public benefit that might otherwise be conferred. And in 1982, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld that decision. Given the cultural and now legal shift that has taken place in the United States, and indeed in many ways worldwide, I think that it is neither extreme nor pessimistic to think that in the coming years our religious institutions could well face manipulations such as the revocation of things like tax-exempt status, as well as other interference in the use of property, in the accomplishment of the mission of these religious institutions, and in the practice of their faith. How might this take place? Well, the most obvious example would be that those who hold what has been accepted universally as marriage for as long as people have been copulating are increasingly coming to be seen as the moral equivalent of racial bigots. Now, this could easily be implemented by some tax ruling or some judge's decision or by an executive order that says that such churches or institutions are, to use the words, not in harmony with the public interest, and that their purpose is so at odds with the community conscience as to undermine any public benefit that might otherwise be conferred, thus revoking their legal status. To be clear, I do not think that the religious mission began on the precondition that our institutions be tax-exempt ones, or even that they have legal status. Certainly, if the law should change, this alone would put some organizations out of business, and it would increase the operating expenses for others. It might frighten some into the catacombs or to the hillsides. It might frighten others, as I think has already begun to happen, into silence. Yet this by itself, were we to lose a tax-exempt status or legal status, would not be the end of the world. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that it is great that churches and other nonprofits enjoy the benefit of not paying taxes. Personally, if it was up to me, I would extend that exemption to all of you. But nobody asked me. But I ask you this, would this pogrom stop only with organizations that performed wedding ceremonies? Could, you might ask, the tax collector come, for example, maybe to the Acton Institute and demand that we pay tribute to the state in the form of taxes because our nonprofit educational work does not replicate existing governmental programs? Could that happen someday? We don't have to wait a week. We don't have to wait for someday. It has already happened. Incredibly, the City of Grand Rapids Assessor's Office refuses to acknowledge the Acton Institute's tax-exempt status. At the federal level, this has been conceded since our inception 25 years ago. Now, to be sure, you may count on it, we are appealing the City of Grand Rapids' decision to the tax tribunal, and we will take the matter all the way to the state Supreme Court if we need to. The city's intransigence, which some inconceivably believe might be politically motivated. I'm not saying that, but some people might say that. Yeah, I might say that. But what this has done is taken from our relatively modest nonprofit think tank $330,000 in real and personal property taxes over the past 3 years, dating from the time that we first acquired our building at 98 Fulton. Actually, our current property assessment now exceeds $100,000 a year. Now consider the irony of this. Many soup kitchens down the street from the Acton building pay nothing to the city. As well-meaning as they are, and as important as they are to fulfill what is an obvious extreme need in certain cases, they primarily treat the symptom of poverty. They pay nothing to the city because the city exempts them from paying, and rightly so. But Acton, which seeks the remedy to poverty itself, must pay this city $330,000 ransom for our own good work. The real problem is not a particular policy here or there. It is a way of thinking about the role of government in society, and that is why this is instructive for the entire battle for freedom here in Grand Rapids, in the United States, and around the world. It is the entire philosophy behind the granting of tax exemptions, by the presumption of regulations, zoning laws, accreditation, licensing, and a plethora of other interventions which ratify the assumption that in order to have a social order, a dominant, intrusive state is required. This mentality says that governance cannot be ensured without government, and a pretty hefty one at that. One that looks into the water content of your toilet bowls, the construction of every crib, every cigarette lighter, every sanctuary or new door being put in, designed, built, or painted in your home. It is the statist assumption which governs communities from Grand Rapids to Washington, D.C., and almost everything in between. And that is what concerns me more, because it leads to deeper and more serious obstructions. In other words, if one believes, as I know that many bureaucrats and politicians do, as you saw on the tape, that tax exemption is a form of subsidy from the government because the government is the normative manner in which society institutionalizes itself, if that is the case, rather than seeing tax exemption as being a way in which communities of free men and women can be alleviated from unnecessary burdens in order to accomplish things that they see right in front of them, then I suggest to you that a number of things can logically follow. This, in effect, first off, turns the principle of subsidiarity right on its head. What this means is that the first and most normative social actor becomes the state, rather than people acting as neighbors to others in need, to others in their communities. It presumes that money produced by citizens belongs to the state, rather than to the people who produced it in the first place, and the people without whom it would have never been produced at all. This way of thinking provides the justification for using other legal mechanisms to obstruct the work of our churches and other vital mediating institutions, including the family itself. How? By rendering ineligible for funding from either public or private sources charities associated with religious institutions, by the removal or denial of licenses and accreditation needed for them to legally and freely function. Think soup kitchens, shelters, daycare facilities, clinics, and the like. And by the use of eminent domain laws, which were nefarious in their inception and notorious in their expansion, which confiscate private property and put that property to the use of those who, in power, consider it to be a true social use. Think also of a similar application of zoning laws to outlaw or restrict or control the construction or the placement or the location of churches or church-affiliated institutions. And why not, while you're at it? Maybe families that are just too big, that have too many kids. Now, do you think this is too radical a projection or too hyperbolic an assessment? I would remind you that we are already today seeing a governmental mandate attempting to force specific kinds of medical procedures onto religious private institutions. Why would that trajectory have to stop with our ability to govern our institutions? And remember this, in a statist world, everything becomes public. Every private interaction, every act of commerce. Why could it not continue the control of individuals within their own professions or among their private associations? Why not businesses who, once they have entered what they call the stream of commerce, a legal phrase that effectively socializes the majority of private economic transitions that take place anywhere? All of this is a reality. It's logical. And don't think they're not thinking about it. It doesn't take a wild imagination to speculate how uncomfortable counselors, teachers, medical doctors, pharmacists, psychiatrists, psychologists might begin to feel if they were threatened with the loss of their credentials, their licenses, that enabled to practice their trade if they did not prove themselves socially useful. Now, once we live under a government that presumes itself to be the provider and the governor of the vast majority of social arrangements and contracts in society, my friends, I think that the observations of Pope Benedict XVI become most pressing. He said, he warned, the state which would provide everything, absorbing everything into itself, would ultimately become a mere bureaucracy incapable of guaranteeing the very thing which the suffering person needs, namely loving, personal concern. We do not need, he said, a state which regulates and controls everything, but a state which, in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, generously acknowledges and supports initiatives arising from different social sources and combines spontaneity and closeness to those in need. The role of such a vast and intrusive government empowers politicians to become a new aristocracy with bureaucrats as their henchmen. And this is where the phenomenon of lobbying originates. It doesn't originate in businesses, but in regulators who can grant favors. Once a class of people becomes powerful enough to provide advantage to others by granting favors rather than by enforcing contracts, then they must be approached for permission for businesses to thrive and grow. A natural instinct, I might even call it a survival instinct, arises when we see this status trajectory. We begin to think that the only thing to be done is to get the right guy into power. It becomes a struggle over power. Now, let me preface what I'm about to say with an assurance to those of our friends who support politicians and who are themselves politicians. I speak to you with great compassion and affection and passion. After all, even the Lord himself ate with tax collectors and sinners. But I am reminded of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's evocative warning when he said, "If you board the wrong train, it is no use running along the corridor in the other direction." Over the past 25 years, I have watched good people invest sometimes very heavily in the election cycle with the great hope that if we just get the right person, a decent, law-abiding, believing, non-corrupt, economically astute, principled leader into office, that such a leader would be electable and would change things. My friends, change doesn't come about because good people get elected. Good people get elected because something has changed. Something already in the electorate, something already in the society, something already has changed in the hearts and the minds of people in a free society. Now, I don't advocate an abandonment of the political fight or a withdrawal from political engagement, nor do I deny that politics can change a culture. Hear me well when I say that I disagree with those who are calling for us to yield to a sectarian impulse and think that it is best to retreat from the world in order to preserve it by preserving our culture and protecting our families. I disagree with this strategy because, frankly, there is no place to retreat from. Technology has made that option impossible. Even if it was once a viable option, it is no longer a viable option. On the other hand, it is also a deadly mistake to think that politics is the only cultural engagement possible, or that political engagement is primary in saving culture. It is not primary. And like economics, politics must be guided by a standard beyond its own logic. It must be guided by truth and by ethics. Most often, the cultural change that politics can more easily affect isn't for the better, it's for the worse. It's much easier to dismantle something than it is to put something back together again. Now, I don't deny that politics and law affect our culture. It is significant. But in the end, culture is a far more powerful force. In the end, the Roman Empire moved from persecuting to tolerating Christianity because Judaism and Christianity changed the empire's culture, not the other way around. It is this connection that I would like to make to something that is much spoken about but little understood. And you hear it all the time, and that is tolerance. shouldn't we be tolerant? Let me just make a few observations on what I call the virtue of tolerance, even though tolerance is not exactly a virtue, but it is a subcategory of one of the cardinal virtues, which is known as fortitude. Obviously, we don't tolerate things we endorse, right? We embrace things that we endorse. The fortitude of which tolerance is a subset is needed precisely because we tolerate things of which we do not approve, things we do not endorse, things we do not share. And here's another element of this discussion which I think can clarify things for us immensely. Tolerance is a response, it is the moral response of a moral people to other persons. But it is not an appropriate response to wrong ideas, to ideas that we find erroneous. When we do not share ideas, when we do not share concepts or doctrines, we disagree with them. And hopefully we do it because we think they are wrong, maybe even harmful. And depending on how these dangerous ideas may be implemented and how dangerous they are, then we're called upon to disagree with them more vigorously and indeed ruthlessly. In the course of a radio interview some years ago, this was on public radio, I frequent public radio on a regular basis for my penance. But in this conversation, I was accused by an exasperated and rather progressive minister. Have you ever noticed how often these two things come in the same package? And here's what he said to me. He said, "Father Sirico," he said, shaking his head, "you think that everything you think is the truth." And I paused, surprised that he did not see the absurdity of this position. For such is the usual befuddlement of progressives. I pleaded guilty to the charge. And I only asked him to reply, "And, sir, which of your strongly held positions do you believe not to be true?" Yes, this ruthlessness ought not be applied to persons. It ought to be applied to ideas and to concepts. But to persons, all of whom, no matter how erroneous or disagreeable they are beings fashioned in the image of God, with eternity inscribed on their hearts. Each of them is a being of wonder and no mere mortal, as C.S. Lewis reminded us. Each of them is destined to be either an immortal horror or an everlasting splendor, but they are not mere mortals. So, my friends, let us be ruthless with ideas, but always strive to be infallibly gentle with people. I suspect that this form of fortitude of which I've spoken may be more and more required of us in the days ahead. It may well come to a point in this land that legally, culturally, institutionally, and economically things will be difficult for us for a while. I pray it will not be so. How sad it would be should freedom be lost on our watch. This is why it is imperative that we prepare ourselves for any eventuality. First, we prepare ourselves spiritually for what may lie ahead. Thankfully, our rich tradition leaves us the insights of great sages and saints that help us to know how to respond to difficulty, to suffering, to loss, to persecution. We know how to do that. We know that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians. But it really all boils down to this, that we must love the truth more than we love ourselves. We must love the truth more than we love our possessions. And we must love the truth even more than we love happiness in this world. Truth, after all, can be its own consolation. We must prepare ourselves, and we must prepare the next generation of leadership to understand the moral foundation and the virtuous manner in which business ought to be conducted. And we must be confident in the truths that built our civilization, stone upon stone, brick upon brick. We must be confident that human beings are bearers of this Imago Dei, endowed with reason, intelligence, creativity, and freedom. And by virtue of this anthropology, they have both the right to produce and possess the fruits of that labor. And because of this anthropological reality, every single human possesses certain inalienable rights, and they possess these rights in their own persons. Rights that are not granted them by any government, by any religion, even by any family. Rights that are theirs simply because they exist. I insist upon this before you tonight, that this understanding of the human person is at the very foundation that enabled our ancestors to build so free and prosperous a civilization that the world has ever known, because they found themselves not driven by greed or vain ambition or coercive mandates. They were driven by the capacity to dream of a better life for their children and their grandchildren, because they saw the potential uses of things that others had missed or passed over, because they were creative, they were risk takers, and they were free to construct the most prosperous experiment the world has ever known. In the 21st chapter of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus proposes a moral dilemma in the form of a parable. A man asks his two sons to go and work for him in the vineyard. The first son declines, but the latter, he declines, and then later, he ends up going. The second son tells his father he will go, but he never does. Who, Jesus asks, did the will of the Father? Now, although I am loath to argue that Jesus' point here in this parable is an economic one, I cannot help take from it a moral lesson which pertains to that perennial argument over how to evaluate the accomplishments of the two dominant and contending economic systems over the last 2 centuries, and to evaluate their respective achievements for the common good. The claims of those in favor of various forms of central planning have asserted its moral authority and its moral superiority over the free economy in terms of its social aim, in creating community, and in the betterment of the common good. Socialism, the argument goes, is about society, while capitalism is only about capital, about money. That's persuasive to a lot of people. The claims of those advocating a decentralized planning and spontaneous order society have often remained silent against this claim. And they've tended to focus rather on the efficiency of markets for their profitability, often lacking an emphasis on the social or the moral dimensions of the question. When we step back and look at what each of these general systems have left in its wake, we see that the son who said he would tend the vineyard actually not only neglected the vineyard, but ransacked it and left it a waste. While the son, who showed no initial interest in the vineyard as such, ended up taking great care of it and teasing out of it abundance and causing it to flourish. You and I have a solemn obligation to tell the truths we know, and to do so with clarity, with patience, with winsomeness, and with confidence. A quarter century ago, the Acton Institute was founded in this city to extend the idea that the building of society means taking seriously both the moral and the empirical aspect of our common life. I suggest to you that if we are well formed, theologically, morally, intellectually, and economically, and if we can impact and leave another generation so similarly formed and so similarly confident in the veracity not only of the empirical achievements of the free and virtuous society, but also with a firm grasp of the underlying moral foundation of such a society, then the legacy of the Acton Institute, entrusted to each of us, will long, long endure. Thank you very much.